to rise together to defend our liberty and unity. Oh, sons and daughters of Africa, flesh of the sun and flesh of the sky, let us make Africa a tree of life. Let us all unite and sing together to uphold the bonds that frame our destiny. Let us dedicate ourselves to fight together for lasting peace and justice on earth. Oh, sons and daughters of Africa, flesh of the sun and flesh of the sky, let us make Africa the tree of life. Let us all unite and talk.
Hello, welcome to Josh Moment. So if you are new to this channel, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, like and share this video. In today's episode, we'll be looking at economic history of Africa. So without much ado, let's start today's episode. So the earliest humans were hunter-gatherers who were living in small family groupings, and even then there was considerable trade that could cover long distances. Archaeologists have found evidence of trade in luxury items such as shells and precious metals across the entirety of the African continent. These were the main trade of the Berber people of Northern Africa. And then Africa's economic history often focuses on explanation of poverty and neglect the aspects such as achievement of the African farmer, traders and states, including improvement in food security and episodes of economic growth. So agriculture supported large towns and eventually large trade networks developed between the towns. The first agriculture in Africa began around the Sahel, and then which is south of the Sahara, which in 5200 BC was far moist and then densely populated than it is today. So several native species were domesticated, most importantly millet, sorghum and cowpea. And these were domesticated throughout West Africa and then the Sahel. Its wide open field made cultivation easier, but then the poor soil condition due to limited rain made intensive farming impossible. The local crops also not ideal and then produced fewer calories than those in other regions. These factors limited surpluses and kept population sparse and scattered. So the case of North Africa took a very different route from the southern regions. Climatically, it is linked to the Middle East, and then the Fertile Crescent and agriculture techniques of that region was adopted by North Africa. This included a different set of crops such as wheat, barley, and grapes. North Africa was also blessed by one of the richest agricultural regions in the world, in the Nile River Valley. With the arrival of agriculture, the Nile region became one of the most densely populated regions in the world as at then, and then Egypt home to one of the first civilizations in the world. So the drying of the Sahara created a formidable barrier between the north and southern portions of the continent. Two important exceptions were Nubia, which is present-day Sudan, or northern Sudan, and then powerful states grew up in this region such as Kush in Nubia, which is modern-day northern Sudan and then southern Egypt, and also Aksum in Ethiopia, the Aksum Kingdom or Empire in Ethiopia. So through Nubia, ideas and technology from the Middle East reached the rest of Africa. Historians believe that ironworking developed independently in Africa. Unlike other continents, Africa did not have a period of copper and bronze working before their Iron Age because they were superior in technology. Copper is quite rare in Africa, and then iron is very common. So let's look at some of the factors that played a key role in Africa's economic history. So one being the Bantu expansion and its impact. So ordinarily, in the sparsely populated area, this same period saw the expansion of the Bantu-speaking people. The Bantu expansion began in southern Cameroon, and Bantu languages are spoken there as of today. And there are archaeological evidence for incoming farmers in northern Gabon around 3800 BC. One of the earliest expansion of the Bantu was the arrival of Southeast Asian food crop, notably the AAB plantain, the cocoyam, and the water yam. Linguistic constructions suggest that the only livestock possessed by the Proto-Bantu was the goat. Over the years, the entire southern half of the continent was covered with this group, excluding the Kalahari Desert. So another factor, sometime in the first millennium, an equally important change began as crops began to arrive from Southeast Asia. The Indian Ocean has been far more open to trade than the turbulent Atlantic and Pacific. Traders could ride the monsoon wind east early in the year and then return east, ride the monsoon wind west early in the year and then return east later in the year. So it is assumed that these crops first arrived in Madagascar, which also adopted Southeast Asian languages sometime between 300 and 800 AD. From the island, the crops crossed to Great African Lakes region. They included many crops, and then most important being the banana. The banana and other crops allow for intensive cultivation in tropical regions of Africa. This was most notable in the Great Lakes region, an area with excellent soil that so many cities and states formed. For most of the first millennium AD, the Aksumite kingdom in Ethiopia and Eritrea had a powerful navy and trading links reaching as far as the Byzantine Empire and India. Between the 14th and 17th century, the Algerian Sultanate, centered in modern-day Somalia, practiced hydraulics engineering and developed new systems for agriculture and taxation, which continued to be used in part of Horn Africa as late as the 19th century. So on the east coast of the continent, Swahili traders linked the region into an Indian Ocean trading network, bringing import of Chinese pottery and Indian fabrics in exchange for gold, ivory, and slaves. Swahili kingdoms created a prosperous trade empire which occupied modern-day Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. So Swahili cities were important trading ports for trade with the Middle East and Far East. In the interior of Africa, trade was far more limited. Low population densities made profitable commerce difficult. The massive barrier of the Congo rainforest were more imposing than the Sahara, blocking trade through the center of the continent. It was the arrival of Islamic armies that transformed the economies of much of Africa. Muslims were far more effective at penetrating the Sahara than the Christians had been. This was largely due to the camel, which had carried the Arab expansion and would soon after carry large amount of trade across the desert. A series of states developed in the Sahel on the southern edge of the Sahara, which made immense profits across the Sahara. The first of these was the Kingdom of Ghana, reaching its peak in the 12th century. Soon, others such as Mali Empire and the Kanem Bornu also arose in the region. The main trade of these states was gold, which was plentiful in Guinea. I like that expression, which was plentiful in Guinea. Also, there was the trans-Saharan slave trade that shipped large number of slaves to Northern Africa. Don't forget, before the Atlantic slave trade, there was the trans-Saharan trade, which was between Africans. Yes, slave trade began long ago. Even most religious books record episodes of slavery. So let's continue. Many worldly empires grew around the coastal areas or large rivers that served as parts of the important trade routes. The kingdom of Mali and Songhai grew along the Niger River between 12th and 15th century. Berber traders from the Sahel, a region south of the Sahara Desert, traded dates, copper, horse, weapons, and clothes that they brought from North Africa in camel trains. Trade with the Berber people and other groups drove the growth of the Ghana Empire, which traded its gold, kola nuts, and slaves. West Africa created a demand for salt, which was collected at desert oases, and they used to preserve food and for seasoning as well. In 1324, Mansa Musa, the king of Mali, made a historically famous Hajj, otherwise pilgrimage, to Mecca. There was an enormous group organized to undertake the Hajj with the king. It included 60,000 men, including also 1,200 servants. And record shows that Mansa Musa gave so much gold in Egypt that its economy became depressed. So between 10th and 14th century, the forest of West Africa became part of trade networks, particularly under the reigns of the Yoruba kings. Ife was a vital trade town along the route from the tropical forest of Guinea. Ife's location also placed it near Benin and the Atlantic Ocean. Yoruba civilization was supported by cities surrounded by farmland, but extensive trade development made it wealthy. By the 10th century, the Bantu-speaking people of Zimbabwe and Southern Africa developed extensive overseas trade with land as far as China and India, from which they received porcelain, beads, and Persian and Arab pots. They traded domestic beef rather than game animals, iron, and ivory. The city of Great Zimbabwe, founded around 10th century, was the center of the Shona kingdom until around the 14th century. So much trade in the forest kingdom was done at the local level, typical by ordinary Yoruba people at local markets. In some towns, these were held every 3 days or 4 days. Clothes, vegetables, meat, and other goods were traded and paid for using small seashells called cowries, which were imported from East Africa. Bars of copper and iron called manilas were produced in standard shape to be used as currency. Other items used in trade as a form of currency also included salt, cloth, bar of gold. So trade with the Middle East began as early as ancient Egypt. Yes. Islam was introduced to Horn Africa early on from the Arabian Peninsula, shortly after the Hijrah. The spread of Islam brought Arab traders as far as Morocco. The Adal Sultanate in the Horn region also maintained bilateral relation with the Ottoman Empire. European influence in the economic history of Africa. So the earliest European colonies settled in North Africa in ancient times. So way before the arrival of the Portuguese, Europeans or European colonists had settled in Africa somewhere in the northern part. So these colonies included the Phoenicians and Greeks. Settlers from ancient Athens and other parts of Greece established themselves along the Mediterranean coast of North Africa. They were later followed by colonists of the Roman Empire. Rome's colonies served as a basis for later European colonial movements into the continent. So Portugal was the first European empire to penetrate deep into sub-Saharan Africa to establish colonies. Portuguese Prince Henry the Navigator, exploration of Africa was driven by two desires: one, to spread Christianity, and two, to establish Africa as a bastion of Christianity against the Ottoman Empire, which was making many Africans to convert to Islam. Also, another motive of the Portuguese was to exploit or to find a new route to India, which would open the entire Indian Ocean region to direct trade with Portugal. And then another motive which the Portuguese had in conquering Africa or territories in Africa was also to control the African gold to finance their explorations to the Indian. The Portuguese began significant trade with West Africa in the 15th century. This trade was primarily the same commodities the Arab had bought: gold, ivory, and slaves. Before it was an agreement, before they started using force. The Portuguese sold to Africans Indian cloth and European manufactured goods, but refused to sell them guns. Soon, however, other European powers such as France, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Great Britain were developing their own trade with Africa, and they had fewer restrictions. There wasn't any restriction by the African to the European. The major European imperial powers in Africa were Portugal, Great Britain, France, and to a lesser extent Germany, Belgium, Spain, and Italy. Portugal's presence in Africa as an imperial power lasted until the 1970s. That's how long they kept in Africa, when the last of its former colonies declared independence after years of war. So let's look at the economic impact of the Atlantic slave trade on Africa's economic history. So the Atlantic slave trade enriched segment of African society that traded in slaves. It is estimated 11.5 million to 15.4 million slaves were transported overseas. That's how impacting the Atlantic slave trade did to the economic history of Africa. So those who would have developed Africa were more or less carried overseas to develop the lands of their colonial masters. So let's look at the colonial era and its impact on African economic history. So the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 regulated European colonization and trade in Africa and during the imperialism period, and coincided with Germany's sudden emergence as an imperial power. The conference ushered in a period of heightened colonial activity by European powers, while simultaneously eliminating most existing forms of Africa autonomy and self-governance. During the colonial time, the economies of Africa was rearranged to serve the interest of Europe and then European colonial masters. And then European industrial chain began in Africa and ended in European industrial warehouses. All of Africa will ultimately fall under European colonial rule by 1914, with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia. The partitioning of African territory among Europeans regime often violated the existing boundaries recognized by the local African states. Under colonial rule, the plantation system of farming was widely introduced in order to grow large quantities of cash crop and employing cheap, often forced labor. So, the implementation and effect of colonial policies were very brutal to the African. One extreme example of exploitation of Africans during this period is the Congo Free State, administered under a form of company rule. The Belgians under King Leopold II allowed businesses to use force as they saw fit on African laborers. The brutal conditions, famine and disease ended in the death of an estimated 10 million Congolese between 1885 and 1908. Belgian government commission in the 1920s found that the population of the Belgian Congo had fallen by as much as 50% under the Congo Free State Company rule, and mostly they were used to cultivating rubber plantation for the Belgians. In white settlers colonies like Algeria, Kenya, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, South Africa and Southwest Africa, now Namibia, the most fertile lands were forcibly expropriated or were forcibly taken from the indigenous population for the use by white settlers. In these countries, African farmers were pushed onto native reserves, usually located on the marginal lands. To some colonizers, such as the British, the ideal colony was based on an open economy, actively engaged in world trade through export of raw material and import of finished goods. The British practiced a policy of light administration, enforcing relatively lower regulations on their colony, especially in non-economic matter. So as long as the British interests were achieved, native people were given greater freedoms to do whatever they like or wanted. Today, many African economies are affected by the legacies of colonialism. In agriculture, the plantation system that they introduced were highly unsustainable and caused severe environmental degradation. For example, cotton severely lowers soil fertility wherever it is grown, and areas of West Africa that were dominated by cotton plantations are now unable to switch to more profitable crops or even to produce food because of the depleted soil. So a major question in Africa's economic history remains poverty. Why is Africa poor? So two approaches will be used to explain this. First being the external approach. So the external approach usually focuses on institutional patterns within economies. It says Africa's economic development is subject to European institutional decisions of the past. European colonial governments had no incentive to create institutions promoting or fostering economic development in African colonies, but rather economic extractions of given resources. Even today, African institutions still depend on these early decisions, and we need to look at that as a people. So internal approach also can be grouped into two. First of the two internal approach is property distribution in Africa. So these usually emerge from setup of the society being more collective than individualistic. Yes. So there are few actions to change this setup. Then I think we need to look into that as a people as well. So the second one being the second internal approach focuses directly on resource endowment within the specific regions, yes, and the scarcity of labor to develop these resources. Also, environmental and political catastrophe combined with several famines during the 1970s and 80s in Ethiopia, Mali, Mauritania, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, among others. The impact of drought and desertification of a large part of the continent also came to a widespread public attention by the early 21st century. So Africa's economy only began to take off in the early 2000s as the political situations improved. Macroeconomic growth plans aimed at improving living conditions began to be implemented. And millions of Africans continue to flock to the city in search of job and other amenities. So we end today's episode here, and if you are new to this channel, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, like and share this video. Hope you learned something today. See you in the next episode, but before we go, don't forget this quote: one day our lives will become history. What will posterity say about you? See you in the next episode.